I feel really honored to be in this church because you have an heroic pastor, and I want to tell you, that's, unfortunately, that's not the norm. And it's why I assume why many of you are here. We're living in strange times, and we're living in times where, sometimes politics finds you or current events finds you, and you have to figure out, what do I do as a believer? How do I speak into this, or do I speak into this? And I want to talk a little bit about that. I want to just tell you, yes, I did write a little bit for VeggieTales, very, very little. I wrote half of Lyle the Kindly Viking. I wrote the Hamlet omelet parody in that, yes. And even more impressively, if you can believe it, I'm the voice of the narrator on the Esther video. So, could somebody bottle that? Wow, that's a weird sound. I have no idea what that meant. I think it was positive, but you're like, oh, that's who you are. No, don't reduce me to that, okay? That's just one thing I did, but no, it's kind of funny that I had the privilege of working at VeggieTales. I've had a really strange career, and I guess I could start there and to say that if you really trust God to lead you, you have no idea where and how He's going to lead you, but you can trust Him to lead you, and you can trust Him that He wants to lead you more than you want Him to lead you. He desires not to trick us and to you missed me, but just to say that if you give Him your heart and you say, Lord, lead me, He will lead you, and it's important to know that. I want to tell you a little bit about my story of coming to faith, and then I want to talk more about the church today. But my story of coming to faith, I put it in the new book that's out. It's called Fish Out of Water, A Search for the Meaning of Life. And when I was searching for the meaning of life, I wasn't really searching for the meaning of life. I don't know if you know what I mean by that. Why would you? Let me explain it. Basically, none of us is particularly searching for the meaning of life. We don't know if there is meaning in life, right? Unless you're told. And so I think if you grow up in America at a time like this, which we've become a very secularized culture, very confused, we sort of get the idea that we don't ask about meaning and truth. That's for those rubes in flyover country in parts of Virginia, right? Yeah? But the fact of the matter is that when you go to your typical college today, you're not told about the meaning of life. If you went to college, 150 years ago or 200 years ago, that was what education was, right? You've got to understand your place in the universe. Who are you? How did you get here? Why are you here? It all comes to God, and everything else is details. But we have really pulled God out of that equation as if you could. You can't. But they've tried, or they you have to give people the benefit of the doubt. Many people honestly believe there is no God and we've just got to figure it out. But if you're really honest, you kind of come to the place there have been very earnest atheists like Sartre or Camus or Anthony Flew, and they ultimately, all three of them, which in my next book, maybe I'll come back in the fall or in next spring to talk about it, but I wrote a book called Is Atheism Dead?, where you examine that atheism is untenable. It is not only utterly illogical, but those who have seriously tried it almost inevitably fail. I mean, if you just want to say, I hate God and I hate Christians and they're stupid, you can have that point of view. But to say there is no God, it becomes absurd. Not only can't we can basically say we know that there is a God. Science and other things have led us to that. I don't have time to go into that. But I think most universities by today, and Yale when I was there in the 80s, have already adopted that view decades before. It's just something that's part of where we are. And they don't talk about the meaning of life because it's embarrassing if you don't believe life has meaning. You don't really want to get into that too explicitly because it's very depressing. If I said to you, look, there's no God, life has no meaning, you evolved out of the primordial soup, therefore what? Therefore there's literally no good or evil. There's literally no such thing as transcendent love. You're just beings that have arisen out of the primordial soup with no purpose, randomly, and it is ultimately extremely depressing if you're paying attention. If you're not paying attention, you go, well, that's interesting. But if you really focus in on it, as some of the great atheists have, very few are brave enough, it's so bleak that it's unbelievably, it's so unbelievably bleak that it's impossible really to live and believe. And you realize, I think, if you really look at it, that it's not possible. But most people don't look that deeply. They just kind of go like, I don't like God, so I'm an atheist. Well, I think that, I was not raised in that kind of a world, and most of us are not raised in that kind of a world. But when you get to places like universities, people are educated enough to believe the dumb things like there is no God, right? And so let me tell you a little bit about how I was raised before I get to the depressing part. My mom, the reason the book is called Fish Out of Water, in part, the book ends with a dream that God gave me around my 25th birthday, which was utterly miraculous. And if you don't have a theology that allows for the utterly miraculous, you're wrong. But I don't have time to go into that right now. But the Lord delivered me in a dream, spoke to me in a dream, totally blew my mind. And in a sense, for the dream to make sense, which I had around my 25th birthday, you kind of have to know my story up to that point. Because the Lord sometimes speaks to us in a way that only we would understand. He's speaking what I call the secret vocabulary of the heart. He knows us, understands us. He invented us. He didn't just make us. He invented each of us. And so sometimes he can speak to us in a way that really wouldn't make sense to anybody else. They'd say, well, I have no idea what that was about. So the dream in which he spoke to me, which I won't say because it's too complicated, but you kind of have to see the rest of my life up to that point. And it has to do with a fish out of water, which is the title of the book. But on a more pedestrian level, Fish Out of Water talks about my experience growing up. My mom came from Germany. My dad came from Greece. They met in an English class in New York City. And so I always say, if you're raised by a German and a Greek, you will be raised Greek. That's like, I don't know where to go with that. It's just the way it is. Greeks know that they're the best nationality. They're not going to apologize. That's just the way it is, okay? So we went to the Greek church and so on and so forth. But part of the reason I say fish out of water is because when I'm hanging around the Greek community, because my mother's German, we don't speak Greek at home, I didn't feel Greek enough. I felt like a fish out of water. I was always trying hard to be more Greek. And just in the flesh, carnally, I was able to finally get to 54%. I don't know how I did it, but I managed somehow, in the natural, to get to 54% Greek. No, but it's just kind of a funny thing. So when I'm hanging out with my German relatives, which, they were really German, my mother came from Germany, I didn't feel German enough. When I was hanging out with the Greeks, I didn't feel Greek enough. And then we hang out with the Americans, you feel like a total freak because you've never played like baseball or done any normal thing because your parents are, they're just glad that they're not being shot at or that there's food on the table because they lived through the war. So it really messed me up is what I'm trying to tell you. I'm messed up. So... No, and the reality is that my parents were tremendously loving parents, and by the grace of the Lord, I have them with me today, not here, but I'll see them soon. My dad's going to be 94 very soon. My mom's going to be, she says 40, but I don't believe it. But I'm just blessed to have them as my parents. And they raised me, I was not raised in an evangelical home. But I think sometimes as evangelicals, we kind of act as though if somebody's not a born-again evangelical, they're like a Marxist, Satanist, atheist, or something like that. And I want to say bluntly that there are a lot of people that maybe the scripture calls them God-fearers, good people, who they have a sense of the transcendent of God. They just don't know maybe what we know. But they're not hostile to it. Many of them are not hostile to it, or they may have some hostility, but by and large, they're interested in what is true. They haven't made up their mind. And so sometimes I think Christians act like I've got to be loaded for bear with apologetics and whatever. And a lot of people aren't coming from that point of view. They've got more simple things. They just want to see God in your life, and sometimes they don't. And you're responsible for them going to hell. I just don't want to put any pressure on you, but it's you. It's you. So I'm joking, but the fact of the matter is I think sometimes we act like, my parents took me to church every Sunday, but it was the Greek Orthodox church, so we were not really schooled in the basics of the faith and the apologetics. It was kind of like, hey, if you're not a Muslim Turk, you're Greek Orthodox, that's good enough. You're baptized, you're done. And I think a lot of times people have that kind of cultural Christianity, right? So it was a tremendously warm environment, and I write about it very lovingly in the book, and some of the stories are insane, funny. But ultimately, when I got to college, I realized I don't know what I believe. And I think that that is the case for a lot of people. They're kind of like sauntering along, and then suddenly they go into the lion's den, which is very hostile to faith. Now, a lot of the universities are that way, but Yale in the 80s was already practically woke, politically correct, culturally Marxist, anti-American. That was the zeitgeist at that time. And I come in there as the working class son of European immigrants, and I'm thinking, what's this? You know, my parents, being raised in Germany and Greece, they knew about communism. They knew about suffering and privation. My mother was raised in Germany, lost her father in the war, and then after the war, it got really bad. Stalin and the Soviets took over. Her part of Germany became East Germany, and it was just tremendously oppressive, so much so that at age 17, with a friend, she escaped East Germany, and we haven't heard from her since. It's amazing. That's a joke. Are you paying attention? Any attention? She escaped East Germany, went to the West, and eventually came to America. But she saw the horror of communism, the horror of it. And so it's not like my parents went out of their way to teach me about it. It was just their stories. It was obvious. If you've seen that or tasted that, you know how horrible and oppressive and awful it is. And when I was, this is all in the book, but in 1971, I was 7, we went over there, and I was basically stunned. You know, you cross the border, and you see machine guns and barbed wire and German shepherds, and you're thinking, this is the world's largest prison. They don't want people to leave. Think about that. Like, that tells you, you know, you don't need to be an adult to understand that's bad, that's horrifying. Why are they doing that? And so I understood that from my mother. My father was in Greece. After the war in Greece, the communists tried to take over. And you know, it's a reality that both my parents raised me with. So the cover of the book is my father at the Statue of Liberty in 1958. My mother took the picture. They were on a date. And I said, that has to be the cover of the book. It's just a beautiful image of my dad. And they, without really trying, just taught me to love America and to understand that freedom is not normal. What we have here is not normal. We are outrageously blessed, even today under the fake administration. And I'm not going to say that in the last service. Is this the last service? I apologize. I take it back. Look, you don't have to. You don't have to agree with me, but you know, in a free country, you can voice your opinion, and I just did. Tough luck. So the fact of the matter is that, without going down that rabbit trail, the fact of the matter is that honestly, we are so blessed in this country that most of us don't realize how blessed we are. We're like the fish that doesn't understand what the water is. He doesn't know anything else. And so I really think that we are obliged to understand through the kind of strange period in which we're traveling at this point that what we have is not normal. It goes away in the blink of an eye, and we need to live out our lives to preserve it and to keep it. I wrote a book called If You Can Keep It, which is what Benjamin Franklin said, leaving the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. A woman said to him, Dr. Franklin, what have you given us, a monarchy or a republic? Now, I always thought that's a joke. Like, she's asking him in 1787, have you given us a monarchy or a republic? Like, what do you mean monarchy? Well, you have to understand, what we have here had never been done in the history of the world. Can we imagine that? What a wild, insane idea it is, self-government? It's not supposed to work. It had never happened before. Why did the founders think this might work? This wild idea that we now totally take for granted, but that my parents didn't take for granted and raised me not to take for granted. Why would it work? Well, Franklin, when he answered that, he gives us a clue. She says, what are you giving us, Dr. Franklin, a monarchy or a republic? And he says, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. The idea being that if we, the people, do not keep the republic and cherish our freedoms dramatically, I don't mean passively, I mean actively cherish our freedoms, teach them, live them out. When somebody tells you you can't say something, scream it in their face. If you don't do that, it goes away. It goes away. And so we need to know what it is and to know that we have to preserve it every moment. We have to live it. Franklin understood that. He understood the Constitution they just created is utterly worthless. It's a piece of paper. It's inert. We have to know what it says, and we have to live it out. We, the people, are the government. And the moment we kind of shrink back and say somebody else has it, the government grows, it is no longer we the people, and we're no longer free. And it's very simple. My friend Os Guinness, some of you must know him, he wrote a book where he talks about the golden triangle of freedom. And this is such a brilliant idea. With typical British diffidence, he says, "Oh, all the founders knew that." Well, wrong, Oz. All the founders may have known the concept, but you put it into this beautiful idea of the golden triangle of freedom. I'll say it quickly and explain it because it's relevant. Basically, the golden triangle of freedom is that freedom requires virtue, virtue requires faith, and faith in turn requires freedom. What do I mean? Freedom is liberty, is self-government, right? You're not being governed by someone else. To be free means you have to govern yourself. How do we govern ourselves corporately and individually? We have to have virtue. In other words, if somebody's not forcing me, if a government is not forcing me to do what is right, and if I have to do it myself, I'm going to govern myself, I have to have virtue. Because if no one's forcing me, why would I do it? I would do it because I believe it's right, and I do what is right because I have virtue. And all the founders did understand that without virtue, there is no way our Constitution can work. Every one of them understood it. So we need to teach it in the schools like math. We've not been teaching it at all. But this is like math. There's no other way to get self-government and liberty. And I have to thank somebody who is not an American citizen, Oz Guinness, for teaching me this idea, which I ought to have learned in school and it ought to have been reinforced all the way through. But whatever little bits of that I did pick up were unlearned or untaught at Yale because they don't get this, they don't understand it. They think there's another way to do it. There is no other way to have freedom. You have to understand what freedom is, and you have to understand how it works. And that, for almost 2.5 centuries, we've effectively been doing. We've been keeping the republic. But in the last 50 or so years, we've kept it less and less, and we've bought into this negative narrative. I'm not going to go into all that. But the point is that that's the only way it works. So freedom requires virtue. But the founders understood, strangely, virtue tends to require faith. Why would you do the right thing if you're not being forced to by some government entity, by a tyrant or some bureaucracy or the deep state, whatever you call it here? Are we outside the Beltway? What do we call it here? I don't know. The point is that if somebody's not forcing you to do it, why would you do it on your own? Well, you say, I have virtue. Why would you have virtue? Well, because you have faith in something greater than the government. The government doesn't need to tell me to pay my taxes or be honest or not to steal or what, because I believe in those things already. I fear God. And I do what the Lord wants me to do. And so I don't need the government to tell me what to do. I don't need a lot of cops telling me don't steal. I don't do those things because I have virtue, because I have faith, and because God says don't steal. And so the founders observed, almost some of them, maybe like Franklin, almost like from a sociological perspective, like you don't need to believe in Jesus, but you notice that those who do believe in him tend to be remarkably good at self-government. They do the right stuff, and they don't need a big draconian government forcing them to do those things. They do it on their own. Well, he noticed, all the founders noticed that people who are particularly religious, particularly people of faith, they are ripe for liberty. They could do it. And that's why the founders really believed, we think we can pull this off, this thing that's never been done in the history of the world. And part of it also has to do with, I got to mention George Whitefield. Some of you know the name George Whitefield. George Whitefield was an evangelist who came here in 1738 and crisscrossed the Atlantic 13 times, died in Newburyport, Massachusetts. And his story also has to be taught in every school in America. You would not have the United States of America apart from that man's life and what he did, any more than if George Washington had not existed. I mean, he's that foundational to who we are and to our freedom. But he was an evangelist. Now let's think about this for a second. If you talk about the connection between faith and freedom, this is a man who preached the gospel of Jesus Christ evangelistically up and down the 13 colonies like a maniac. You cannot even imagine how many sermons he preached to how many multiplied thousands. It's utterly astonishing. I mean, if you read it, if you read his story, it's in my book, if you can keep it. His story is just astonishing, but it's a fact. And I say he makes like Billy Graham and the Apostle Paul look like lazy agnostics. And I kind of mean that. Like, you can't really believe what he did. But 80% of all people in the 13 colonies heard him preach in person at least once. Now, many heard him on the radio, obviously, but very primitive radios in those days. But can you imagine? That's how this culture of the 13 colonies was saturated with gospel preaching, with evangelistic preaching. Tons of people came to faith, were born again out of their dead, Church of England, wherever they were going, that they were not hearing this. And I don't mean to put down the Church of England. I want to specifically put down the Episcopal Church, however. But I'll get back to that. But the fact of the matter is that many people can go to church in a way as I did, and for good or for ill, you're just not getting it. So suddenly people got it. And revival broke out across the 13 colonies. And when Franklin said, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it," the people in Independence Hall putting together this Constitution believed that we think this people can do this. Because freedom requires virtue, virtue requires faith. We think they can pull it off. But faith in turn requires freedom, and that's the magic piece. Imagine if you figured out, hey, we know how to do freedom. We're just going to make everybody be born again and go to church on Sundays, and that'll solve the problem. Well, obviously, once you do that, the people are no longer free. Freedom has to be free. You cannot force people to be free. You can't figure out a formula and then enforce it. It has to be free. So the founders understood that faith itself has to be free. So unlike in the old country, we are not going to compel people to go to this church or that church, or in some places to go to this mosque or that mosque, or in some places not to dare go into a building to worship God. All around the world, we've experienced all kinds of situations where there is no religious liberty. The founders said we have to have religious liberty in America, and the people will be utterly free. They'll be utterly free to choose as they like. And of course, the freedom that we have is, it's a risk. You don't know if people are going to choose that. But they said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to build it so that the state has no right to tell people what to believe or what not to believe. They're totally free. And we're going to see how that goes. We believe that. Well, the fact of the matter is it works gloriously. It's kind of like the best of the free market where people get to choose. And guess what? When they hear something that meets their needs, and they go there. And so there's something beautiful about this golden triangle of freedom. There's no other way that democracy, freedom as we have it, works. And that's such a foundational thing that it ought to be taught, as I said, everywhere, because it really is like math. If America is an idea, which it is, it's not an ethnic group, it's an idea. And if you buy into that idea, my mother and father, with their accents, they are today as American as George Washington because they bought into these ideas and they're part of this. So it's a glorious thing. And God has given us these freedoms, but we the people have to keep it. And so I say this because when you think about that, you realize that even though the government can't force us to believe or to go to church, nonetheless, our kind of government depends on having enough of its citizenry being virtuous and religious and full of faith and loving Jesus. The founders understood that without that, the whole thing falls apart. But it can't be coerced, but it's central. Now, Lincoln talks about the mystic chords of memory. In other words, there are ways that are not authoritarian enforcement that we can encourage these things. We have to teach them freely to our families. We have to go to churches and go to schools where these things are celebrated, where we celebrate America and what it is. And otherwise, it simply goes away. And I think Lincoln understood this very, very keenly. I write about him in the book also because I was astonished at how gloriously he understood this idea. It is really remarkable to me how Lincoln got this idea. But as I say, most of it we get through osmosis, through our parents or whatever. My story was that I got this because my parents had lived in countries where this didn't exist. And so I had this feeling. But when I got to college, I really, was suddenly confronted with a world where people didn't believe that stuff. And so I got lost, and without going into it, it wasn't until my 25th birthday, roughly, which is the denouement of my book, I talk about this insane miracle. So in case you know somebody who's not where you are theologically, it's safe to give them that book, because it's not a Christian book. It's just a book with crazy stories. But at the end, it's about Jesus. But don't tell them. Shh. Don't tell them. Why let them know? Why let them be surprised? But that's kind of the idea. Actually, the publisher, I had a secular publisher, felt that the book wasn't Christian enough and wouldn't publish it as it is. So in order to publish it as it is, I had to go to a Christian publisher. Isn't that weird? Yeah. So anyway, but it's true. But so Franklin says, if you can keep it. And so I realize that most of us don't understand that. And living through a strange time, no matter how you slice it, we're living through a very bizarre time. And I want to let you know, yes, you're not crazy. The world has gone crazy. Like, you need to know that you're not crazy, right? You can't suddenly snap your finger and say, hey, we discovered something in the lab. There's like 1,000 genders, and you need to and don't even bring up that that's not true, because that's evil. Are you kidding me? Like, what is that? That's like, I think that, the Khmer Rouge was more open-minded than that point of view. I just want to say. So it's just astonishing to me that we're living through this strange time, and we have to help each other and encourage each other. Like, that is insane. And there have always been people in history. We've been so blessed in America, we haven't seen this. But if you grew up in Nazi Germany or in many parts of the world, you've seen madness and you've seen evil. And my parents did see it. And so they inculcated that into me, so that I always had a sense that this is not normal. This is a blessing. And we are blessed to be a blessing. So the idea that we do have this, we have a particular duty to do something about this blessing. In other words, if Franklin said, a Republic, madam, if you can keep it, what he's really saying is, if you want to do nothing, if you don't have freedom, you don't have to do anything. You just do what they tell you. But if you have freedom, you are obliged voluntarily to do what you can to preserve the freedom. So to understand how freedom works, what it is historically, why it's an anomaly, and why you need to teach love of country and love of freedom and love of the history and love of the people who died so that we could have the freedom and that we could say anything we like. It doesn't need to be true. We have total freedom in America. So we have a responsibility before God to speak the truth, but we have freedom in America to say anything we like, and that will go away if we do not use our voices and use everything we have to preserve the freedom and to live it out. So anytime you're silent when it's a good time to speak the truth, you become part of the problem. And I say that I say that because my hero and ultimately my friend Chuck Colson, he would talk about Germany in the 30s. There was a phenomenon, some sociologists called it the spiral of silence. In other words, in Germany in the 30s, and again in my Bonhoeffer book, obviously I write about this, which is one reason I understand it somewhat, is that people say, how did that happen in Germany? And it's very convenient for us to say, well, I'll tell you how it happened. It happened because they were just all insane and that's all I know, right? And you go, well, no, here's the problem. They were no different than we are. They were, many of them, churchgoers, many of them actual Christians. How did it happen? It happened very simply. It happened exactly as it is happening now here. This is how it happened. If you don't speak up when there's an opportunity to speak up, tomorrow it'll be a little bit more difficult to speak up. If I talked about gender or Marxism or same-sex marriage or any of these things about the unborn a few years ago, it cost much less than it costs now. Now you think about that. That's because of our silence. That's because of the church's silence. And you could go all the way back. Why didn't we talk about no-fault divorce? Why don't we in other words, every one of these things, every time we say, well, that's not my battle, that's political, I just want to preach the gospel. Folks, that's not what the scripture says, right? We're supposed to speak the truth. We're supposed to speak the truth. We're supposed to be the truth. We're supposed to live the truth. And this idea, this really unbiblical idea, and unbiblical is really a nice word. It really means satanic idea. We need to think about that, right? It's a satanic idea. To separate the gospel and politics. Folks, I wrote about William Wilberforce. Wilberforce not only was political, he was a politician. And his faith in Jesus led him to say, the African slaves suffering the tortures of the damned in the hold of those slave ships and in those plantations in the West Indies, I am obliged as a believer in Jesus to do whatever I can for them. Now, that made him pretty political, didn't it? And there were many people in that day, many Christians and many actual Christians who said, keep your faith private. That's unseemly. What is wrong with you? Well, he said, I cannot. As I read the scripture, I have an obligation before God to speak up. I am my brother's keeper. There's 100 scriptures that tell you you're obliged to speak up. For whether it's for the unborn or the Jews in boxcars going to Auschwitz, if you don't speak up, God is going to hold you accountable because you have a voice. And the Lord gave you that voice to use for his purposes. And if you're afraid to use it, you're a fool, because the Lord says, I have defeated death on the cross. I have crushed death. You are free. You will never die. You need to know that. You don't hope it. Know it, because it's true, and live it. And speak without fear. The only thing you should fear is not speaking the truth. The only thing you should fear is the Lord judging you for not using what he's given you for his eternal purposes. He's given you your freedom for those who are not yet free. He's given you everything he's given you, whether it's treasure, time, talents, good looks, whatever he's given you, it's for his purposes. It's not for you. It's meant to be used for the Lord's purposes. And how many people have voices and they don't use the voice because they're afraid they might lose a little something? Well, that's what self-sacrificial agape love is, to use what you have for others, trusting that the Lord's got your back and you cannot outgive him, ever. You're not going to run out of stuff. So I'm not talking about, having no discernment and being foolish, but I'm saying that God expects his church to live as though they actually believe what he tells them. And many of us aren't so sure. We look around. Well, the fact of the matter is, we need to be encouraged that God desires for us to live out our faith in every single sphere. I don't know if I said in this service, the last one, but what Abraham Kuyper, Chuck Colson used to quote him almost every time he spoke, that the Dutch theologian Abraham Kuyper once said, there's not one square inch of all creation over which Jesus Christ, who is sovereign, does not say, mine. There's not one part of the world, there's no political and religious, it's all God's, and he wants us to redeem it all for him and to bring him into every part of our lives. And we really are here for his purposes in that. So part of that will involve evangelism and making disciples, but also it involves sometimes simply speaking the truth when it's not popular, or crossing the street as the Good Samaritan did. Because he didn't say, hey, I'm busy, I got to go to a service. He said, this is what the Lord requires of me now. But there are a lot of Christians today who would probably say, well, I'm going to pray for that guy, but I'm kind of busy. The fact of the matter is, the Lord wants us to live our faith, to speak boldly, and to discern the times. That we're living in a time right now, more and more people are saying, you can't talk about that, shut up, don't talk about that. You need to know, okay, now's the time to talk loudly, because tomorrow I won't be able to. The freedom that we have, folks, is a gift from God. I want to be really blunt and say it again. My parents raised me mostly to understand this, but then once I read Os Guinness's book and I wrote my book, I thought, wow, I've never understood it explicitly. That we have been so blessed with something so strange and beautiful and fragile, it is required of us to keep it. It doesn't keep itself. We need to keep it. We need to be bold in our expressions of faith. We need to be bold in speaking the truth wherever we go. So again, when somebody says, well, you can't talk about that and you can't talk about that, you need to understand that is a sign that you need to talk about that. It's a sign. When people are trying to shut you up, I was just completely canceled. My whole YouTube channel wiped out. The whole channel. This is not a suspension. It's gone. 220,000 subscribers. Innumerable videos, amazing interviews with amazing people, all gone. Why? Because they said I was spreading misinformation. Now, can I tell you something? I would never, ever, ever knowingly spread misinformation. It's preposterous. I would never say anything that I think shouldn't be said. I would get rid of it. The fact is, they have an animus toward truth. They have an animus toward certain points of view, and they're using their power to enforce that. And let's face it, when people tell you don't speak, it is obviously because they're very afraid of what you might say and the power that it has. This is a spiritual battle. And, they don't know that they're animated by Satan. They are just doing what they think is right. But when you suppress truth, folks, that's not a good thing. And that is what's happening in America today. But the reason it's happening, I would say, ultimately, is because we, the people, have abdicated our role in keeping the republic and in understanding I have to pay a price. If people died so that we could be free, why shouldn't I have to live to preserve the freedom? It doesn't make any sense. And we have to stand up. And as I say, when I was in college, I kind of drank this Kool-Aid. And it wasn't until God had mercy on me around my 25th year that he spoke to me in this dream and opened my eyes. But even so, it's taken many years for me to really work it out, right? Like to understand that I really wasn't living my faith out. I was living it out in this way, in this way, in this way, but not in this way, in this way, in this way. And it's by writing about these heroes of the faith that it has embarrassed me into thinking, my goodness, what am I waiting for? Why am I keeping my powder dry? The battle has been raging, and I'm sitting here as though it hasn't started yet. Well, folks, you know what's going to happen if you don't use the ammunition God has given you, if you don't use your voice and do what you're supposed to do, the battle will be over. You will lose the battle. They'll take the guns away from you, and you'll say, you know what? Darn it. I should have used the rifle. And of course, I am speaking metaphorically, but the point is, if you don't use what God has given you, there will come a time, as happened in Germany, when it will be too late. And you'll be embarrassed, you'll be horrified, because at that point, there's nothing you can do. The Lord has given us in this country freedoms that, as I say, they're so astonishing, so amazing, we don't even know that we have them. But now we're being challenged. I know that in this church and in this area, we're all being challenged. I really believe it's God's mercy to us to say, will you wake up now, please, before it's too late? Do you see now where things go if you don't speak up, if you don't get involved in your local elections, if you don't get involved in your school board, if you don't get involved in these things? Do you see what will happen? And of course, this is just the beginning of troubles, folks. We haven't begun. There is so much evil in this world. If you go to China today and you have the misfortune to be born a Uyghur Muslim, do you understand? They don't believe in God. This is Marxism. This is, critical race theory and BLM. It all comes from Marxism. What do they believe? They believe there is no God, and therefore there's no right or wrong. And so if that's the case, human beings are not special. So if I can profit by murdering you, or if I can make the state stronger by crushing dissent, of course I'll do that. So if you're a Uyghur Muslim today living in China, and many, many American businesses are making millions and billions off of China, and they are murdering their own people. Now, this is not some crazy exaggeration. Boy, do I wish it were. We have a responsibility before God. Since we have freedom, we have voices, we have tremendous economic power in this nation and military power to stand against these wickednesses around the world. There are people longing for someone to speak up for them, just as the Jews in the boxcars and the African slaves in the hold of the slave ship were thinking, I wonder if there's anybody out there who really believes what they say they believe and will live it out. Wouldn't that be amazing? We're longing for those people. There are people all over the world today longing, in North Korea and everywhere, that we would really live out our faith as though we really believed it. This is a moment for the church to stand. This is a moment for us to be who God called us to be. I think I mentioned Wilberforce, I mentioned Bonhoeffer. I think of Martin Luther. Martin Luther, the reason he was not afraid to be burned alive is because he feared eternal damnation more. He feared God more than he feared man. You can kill the body, but God has defeated death. If you don't believe that, folks, when the chips are down, you're not going to do what God created you to do. We were created to live out our faith in every sphere of life. We have never had it teed up for us better than we do today in America. If the church in America today will be the church, not play church, but be the church, those called out by God, and live as though he really did defeat death on the cross. Those 21 martyrs in orange jumpsuits on the shore who were beheaded, it seems to me they believed that he had defeated death. Since 2,000 years ago, people have lived their faith out that way, and others have lived out their belief in what is right and true and have died for freedom. It is incumbent on us, who are the beneficiaries of what the Lord has done and what the martyrs have done and what patriots have done, to do what we can now, because history is looking at us and the Lord is depending on his church simply to be the church, and to know that freedom cannot flourish unless the church is the church. That's the way the Lord designed freedom, and the founders got it, and they set it up, but they could not guarantee it forever. It is up to we the people to keep the republic. It is up to we the people to live out our faith in every single sphere of our lives. I believe as a result of these travails, revival is coming to America. God has heard the innumerable prayers that have gone up. The Lord has heard this. You don't think he hasn't heard those prayers? Do you know how many people around the world? I've been on prayer calls, and there are people all around the world praying on these calls for America, because they understand, if we don't, that America is the bellwether country. The Lord has appointed us to hold the torch of freedom in a way that no one else has been appointed. And if the Lord chooses you for something like that, you better believe you have a burden and a responsibility that no one else has. So don't do this just for your kids, although you should, and your grandchildren, but do it for those around the world who are looking to us, longing to have what we have and don't appreciate, longing to have that. Folks, we're on the hook for them. We are our brother's keepers. And if you care about Uyghur Muslims and you care about people in North Korea, we need to preserve liberty here. It is going away, but if the Church of Jesus Christ will stand. And by the way, Luther said, "Here I stand, I can do no other." He didn't say, "I want to stand." He understood logically there is no alternative for him but to stand in what he believes God said and to trust God with the results. And if you kill me, you kill me. I don't care. I trust God, who is life and who is truth. So it's up to us. We do not do it in our own strength, folks. We are called to do something so glorious that it's inconceivable. We get to participate in something this beautiful. It's an opportunity God has given us. It's why we're here. It's why we were saved. And I want to exhort you to lean on him in the midst of this and know that he has appointed his church, which is us, to do these things at this time in history, and he will do what he's going to do. But he is looking to us. And it's a glorious privilege that we get to live in this free country and that we can say what we like. So make sure you do. God bless you. Thank you.